Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The house they gave my sister was built on money they once took from me, and for years I kept quiet because I thought silence was the only way to keep the family together. But that night, when my parents stood in the middle of their living room and announced the so-called surprise gift, I felt something in me finally snap. I grew up watching my sister, Lauren, glide through life as if the world had been built to keep her comfortable, while I was expected to cover gaps, to do the work no one wanted, to be the one who didn't ask for more than the bare minimum. It wasn't just the big things either, though those cut the deepest. It was the pattern, the constant message that her needs were urgent while mine could wait indefinitely. She got a car at 16 while I had to work double shifts at the diner just to pay for a used bike. She got tuition support that was supposedly fairly balanced, but when I checked the paperwork years later, I realized my so-called college fund had been borrowed by my parents during a rough patch and never restored. They called it a loan, swore they'd put it back once things stabilized, but it never happened, and I ended up patching together scholarships, part-time jobs, and credit card debt just to graduate. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had made peace with being invisible in the family dynamic. I rented modest apartments, bought secondhand furniture, and learned how to manage without asking anyone for help. Meanwhile, Lauren seemed to stumble from one safety net to another: a wedding my parents paid for, a separation where they stepped in to cover her rent, and later, constant bailouts whenever she overspent. I told myself it wasn't worth fighting over because what could I really do? Point out the imbalance and be labeled jealous? Start a war I couldn't win? I swallowed my resentment and told myself I was strong because I had built everything I had on my own. But that night changed everything because it was no longer about petty favoritism or a few extra bills paid here and there. This was a house. A whole house, transferred in her name, and celebrated like it was the most natural thing in the world. The announcement came with champagne glasses and a slideshow of renovation plans, and I remember standing there, clapping with everyone else, but feeling my chest tighten as my mother said, "We just want to make sure Lauren has stability. Because she deserves it after everything she's been through." I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was insulting. Stability? Deserved? What about me? The one who paid off their medical bills when Dad's insurance only covered part of the surgery. What about the years I sent money home from my first job to keep the mortgage current when they hinted things were tight? I was treated like a walking emergency fund, yet no one thought twice about rewarding Lauren with the ultimate symbol of security. I excused myself to the kitchen, not because I was going to cry, I had trained myself out of that, but because I needed space to think. When I came back, I forced a smile, hugged my sister, and asked for the address so I could send a housewarming card. They all thought it was a sweet gesture, but in reality, I just wanted to see it in black and white. I'm not proud of how calm I looked in that moment, but I had learned long ago that showing my anger only gave them a chance to dismiss it as bitterness. The truth was, I wasn't bitter. I was tired of pretending I didn't see the pattern, and for once, I was curious enough to dig. That night, sitting in my apartment with the address typed into the county's property search website, I felt a chill run down my spine when the record loaded. The deed didn't just show a simple transfer. It showed the house was categorized as a gift, no payment listed, no mortgage tied to Lauren's name. It also listed a lien attached not long before the transfer, a contractor's lien, unpaid and unresolved. I stared at the screen, replaying years of conversations in my head. The time my mom promised they'd put the money back into my college fund, once things stabilized, the constant reminders that I was so independent, the way they praised me for not needing help while pouring resources into my sister's comfort. Suddenly, it wasn't just unfair. It was a system, one I had unknowingly supported by keeping quiet. And the lien? That was my first crack in the illusion. If Lauren's house wasn't clean, if there were debts tied to it, then the story wasn't as picture-perfect as they wanted everyone to believe. I closed the laptop and sat in silence for a long time, not because I didn't know what to do, but because for the first time in my life, I felt like I had leverage. It wasn't about begging for fairness anymore. It was about seeing the cracks in their carefully built image and realizing I could finally choose whether or not to keep them covered. I had spent years carrying weight they refused to acknowledge, but maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to put it back where it belonged. I didn't know how far I was willing to go yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done being invisible, and if they thought this house gift was the end of the story, they had no idea what was coming next. Because the truth was, that gift wasn't built on generosity, it was built on lies, old debts, and the assumption that I'd stay quiet forever. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't planning to. I did not sleep that night because once I saw the words gift transfer next to my sister's name and the notice of a contractor lien hanging on the same parcel like a small warning flag that everyone at the party had chosen to ignore, my brain flipped from hurt to method, and when I get methodical, I stop waiting for permission and start taking notes. So I made coffee, opened my laptop, and taught myself how county records work, how deeds and assessments are logged, and how the dull language of a clerk's entry can quietly contradict the big emotional story a family tells about sacrifice, love, and deserving. What I found first was simple enough to explain to anyone who has ever dealt with property taxes. A deed recorded as a gift meant there was no sale price attached, which is fine on paper if the people involved are clear about what that actually means. But in our case, it also meant there was no mortgage in Lauren's name, no bank asking questions, and therefore no outside adult to slow down the fairy tale, and when there is no bank there is only family and willpower and whatever someone like me is willing to swallow. The second part was messier, because the lien that popped up belonged to a kitchen remodel that had been rushed ahead of time for the big reveal, and the contractor who filed it had written in the comment field that payment stopped after change orders were added, which told me everything I needed to know about how the project likely went. Big dreams, poor planning, and a promise to handle it later once the applause died down. I could have confronted them that morning, but I heard an old voice in my head, my own, reminding me that feelings were never my currency in that house, and that the only language that ever made anyone pause was paperwork. So instead of calling my mother and begging for an explanation, I arranged my day to visit the title office during my lunch break, and there I met Alicia, who had the kind of patient clarity you only get from explaining the same rules 1,000 times without turning cruel. And she walked me through the basic mechanics of liens and notices, saying in plain English that a contractor who is not paid has the right to record a claim that sits on the property until it is satisfied or released, and that these filings are not dramatic, not personal, not moral judgments, but simply the way grown-up systems keep track of unfinished business. I stood there with my little notebook and wrote down her phrases like they were survival rules, not dramatic, not personal, just a system, and if you follow the steps you do not have to raise your voice. Back at home, I dug into the folder I had kept for years at the bottom of my closet, a cheap accordion binder full of photocopies that I had made in my early 20s when I still lived at home and helped with bills. The pages my mother used to write when she promised to make me whole after using my graduation money for a mortgage payment and my college savings for a stretch of medical expenses during Dad's recovery. And I ran my fingers over the faded ink of her handwriting and felt that old mix of disgust and loyalty rise up again, but this time I pressed it down because I did not need the feeling, I needed the proof. It was all there. Dates, amounts, little notes that said, "We will replace this when tax season hits," and "Thank you for understanding," and the familiar refrain that I was the strong one, the independent one. The one who could stand on her own while they helped Lauren get stabilized, and the irony was almost funny because apparently stability only came in one flavor. And it tasted like my money. The question that mattered now was not whether the past was unfair, but whether the present gave me a clean, adult way to correct the story without lighting myself on fire. So I called the number listed on the lien and reached Daniel, the contractor whose name I had already seen on the permits, and I let him talk before I said anything, because men who work with their hands can smell spin from a mile away, and he told me the job had ballooned when my sister added high-end finishes, then turned tense when payments started arriving late with promises attached, and he said he did not like filing liens, but he liked being stiffed even less, and when I asked him what he wanted now he surprised me with how small his ask really was. He wanted to be paid, to be done, and to never speak to my family again. I told him I understood, that I was not calling to threaten anyone, and asked a simple question I would not have known to ask a day earlier. Would he consider assigning me his lien? If I covered a fair amount and handled the rest according to the rules, and after a pause long enough to make me think he was going to hang up, he said that if I was serious and if a title officer could set up the paperwork, he would meet me and transfer the claim because he had other jobs and no appetite for family drama. When I hung up, I sat very still, because it felt like I had just picked up something heavy without grunting, like I had moved from begging to bargaining in one phone call, and, while a part of me wanted to run to my parents and wave the possibility in their faces, the grown part knew that silence was my ally now, that I needed to move one step at a time and let the system do what my pleas never could. I called Alicia and asked her, in the same careful tone she had used with me, how an assignment would work, what forms were needed, and how notice would be delivered so that no one could say I had ambushed them. And she laid it out with a kind of elegant simplicity that made me wonder why I had ever believed power required volume. That night I drafted a list: meet Daniel, notarize the assignment, file it, send the required notice to Lauren and to my parents, copy the homeowners association because the remodel had triggered a compliance note in the permit history, and wait. Not with anger, but with the calm patience of someone who finally recognizes she is not asking for a favor, she is enforcing balance. I looked at the address again, pictured the kitchen my mother had cooed over in her slideshow, and I felt something I had not felt since I was a teenager, not anger, not even relief, but a quiet click of alignment. Because if they had built that gift on the assumption that I would keep swallowing, then they had miscalculated, and if they thought I would stand in the driveway and argue about feelings, then they did not understand me at all. Since all I planned to do was follow instructions, a kind woman at a counter had handed me on a printed sheet. As I turned off the lamp, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother that said she hoped I was not overthinking things, and that family should just be happy for each other, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was late for that kind of advice, and because by the time she woke up the next day I would already have a meeting set with the contractor and a notary scheduled at lunchtime, and the first envelope with my name on the letterhead would be ready to mail, which is when I realized I had crossed a line I could not uncross, and I did not want to. By the time I met Daniel in person, I had already rehearsed every possible outcome in my head. From him laughing me off as some meddling sibling trying to stir up trouble to him refusing outright because he did not want to get tangled in what he must have sensed was a messy family situation. Yet the reality was far simpler. Almost disappointingly so, because when money is owed and people are tired of chasing it, the only language that matters is clarity, and when I laid out the exact offer, that I would cover a fair portion now, that I would handle the rest according to the rules, and that he would never have to hear my sister's name again, he nodded, signed the assignment papers in front of the notary, and left with a check that bought his relief and handed me something I had never held before, a piece of paper with legal weight that said I was no longer an outsider to the story, but someone with standing. Someone whose voice could not be dismissed as jealousy or bitterness. Because it was now attached to a lien filed with the county. I walked out of that office with the document in a plain folder, and for the first time in my life I felt the balance of power tilt just slightly in my favor, not because I screamed louder, but because I was finally playing on the same field they had always reserved for my sister, the field where ownership, leverage, and paperwork matter more than hurt feelings or family lectures. Filing the assignment at the county clerk's office was less dramatic than I expected. There was no stampede of gasps or flashing red lights, just a clerk who glanced at the form, checked the boxes, and slid it back across the counter with a receipt. I stood there for a moment, oddly disappointed that no one seemed to grasp how seismic this was for me, but then I realized that was exactly the point. Power does not announce itself, it moves quietly. It shifts beneath the surface until suddenly the ground feels different, and those standing on it realize too late that nothing will ever be the same. The next step was the notice of assignment, a simple letter drafted with Alicia's help, sent by certified mail to both my sister and my parents, outlining the lien, the amount, the deadline, and the options for resolution. It was not a threat, it was not emotional, it was not even angry. It was a fact sheet, a schedule, a statement that if they wanted to live in that perfect kitchen with the glossy countertops and the stainless appliances my mother had bragged about in her slideshow, they needed to deal with me, because now I was the creditor and ignoring me was no longer an option. Their reaction came faster than I anticipated. A group text from my mother, frantic and dramatic, accusing me of attacking family, of trying to humiliate them, of being cruel when I should have been happy for my sister. I read it twice, not because the words hurt. I had been called jealous and bitter too many times for it to sting anymore, but because of how predictable it was, as if she had a script ready. As if the idea of me stepping outside the role of silent support was so unthinkable that the only explanation could be malice. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I sat with the letter I had already prepared for the Homeowners Association, attaching the lien notice and highlighting the fact that the remodel had been completed without clearing a compliance issue. A detail Daniel had mentioned almost in passing, but one that turned out to be a lever of its own, because in a neighborhood that prized order and appearances, violations were not tolerated, and suddenly my quiet paperwork had pulled a second thread from the illusion my parents had built around Lauren's gift. When Mr. Patel from the HOA board called me back, his voice was courteous but firm, explaining that any lien tied to a property within the association's jurisdiction was automatically logged, and that outstanding compliance notes meant the board would have to review the matter at the next meeting. He did not ask me why or how, he did not probe into family dynamics, because for him, as for Alicia, it was not dramatic and it was not personal, it was simply process, and process is impartial in a way people rarely are. I thanked him, hung up, and looked at my phone again, which now had 3 missed calls from my sister, each one more insistent than the last. I did not answer those either, because there was nothing to explain. The notice was in their mailbox, the HOA had been looped in, and every move I had made so far was fully documented, fully legal and fully mine. That evening, my father sent me a separate text, shorter than my mother's, and the tone was different, almost pleading, telling me that while he understood I felt hurt, this was not the way to handle things, that family matters should stay private. That dragging neighbors into it was crossing a line. I stared at that message for a long moment, because for years I had convinced myself that my father was the quieter, fairer one, the one who might eventually balance the scales if I gave him enough time. But now here he was asking me to retreat back into silence, to undo what I had done, not because it was wrong, but because it had consequences. And I realized in that moment that my father's so-called fairness was just another way of maintaining peace on their terms, never mine. I typed a reply that said simply, "It is already public," and I sent it, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because it was the truth, and the truth was no longer mine to carry alone. As I set my phone down and let the weight of the day settle, I thought about the years I had begged them to recognize what they had taken, the years I had argued for fairness and been dismissed as dramatic, and I felt an almost bitter laugh rise in my chest, because it turned out I had been using the wrong tools all along. I had tried words, and words had been ignored. I had tried patience, and patience had been wasted, but paperwork, simple, boring, undeniable paperwork, had accomplished in 1 week what decades of pleading could not. And the irony was almost too sharp to bear. Yet I also knew this was only the beginning, because the notice set a deadline, the lien carried obligations, the HOA board would meet in 2 weeks, and every step from here would either force my parents and my sister to address the imbalance or expose them further. I closed my folder, placed it carefully on the table, and poured myself a glass of water, and as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, I realized that for the first time, I was not waiting for their approval or dreading their disapproval. I had created a timeline, a process, a sequence of steps that existed whether they liked me or not, and that realization filled me with a calm I had never known before. They could rage, they could plead, they could spin stories about my cruelty, but none of it mattered now, because the county clerk did not care about family politics, the HOA did not care about favoritism, and the lien assignment sitting in my folder did not care about who cried louder. What mattered was that I had leverage, and leverage was something they had never expected me to find. let alone use. The homeowners association meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, the kind of small-town gathering where people normally argue about fence heights or landscaping rules. But on that night the room carried a different kind of energy because everyone already knew that a lien had been filed, a remodel had been flagged, and a conflict that was supposed to remain neatly hidden inside my family had spilled out into a space where neighbors could listen, comment, and quietly judge. I walked in without fanfare, carrying only the same thin folder I had brought to every step of this process, while my parents and Lauren arrived together in a show of unity. My mother clutching a binder of photographs that looked more like a real estate brochure than evidence, as though beautiful pictures might outweigh unpaid bills and unfinished paperwork. My father looked tired, resigned in a way I recognized from years of watching him silently back my mother's narratives even when he knew they were half-truths, while Lauren looked defensive, her chin tilted upward in the same posture she had used since childhood whenever anyone dared question her decisions. When the meeting began, Mr. Patel, the HOA chair, explained calmly that the board had received notice of a contractor lien against the property and a compliance issue related to the remodel, which triggered the need for review. And he made it clear that this was not about gossip but about process, which gave me a small thrill because once again the framework was protecting me from being dismissed as merely jealous. Lauren immediately jumped in, her voice quivering with carefully rehearsed indignation, claiming the contractor had exaggerated, that she had tried to work out a fair deal, that the lien was unnecessary, and that the remodel was completely safe and beautiful, which she backed up by sliding glossy photographs across the table as though the gleam of stainless steel appliances could erase legal filings. My mother nodded emphatically at every word, adding that I was dragging the family's private matters into a public setting out of spite, painting me as vindictive while portraying Lauren as the victim of a petty vendetta. I let them talk because I had learned that interruptions only gave them ammunition, and when it was finally my turn, I did not raise my voice. I did not lace my words with venom. I simply opened the folder, pulled out the lien assignment, the certified mailing receipts, and the copies of my mother's own handwritten IOUs from years earlier, and I laid them neatly on the table, one by one, explaining in plain, measured sentences that this was not about jealousy or feelings. It was about debts, records, and obligations that had been ignored until now. The silence in the room as I spoke was almost tangible, because neighbors who had watched my family project perfection for decades were suddenly seeing cracks in the facade, and while none of them said anything outright, the subtle shift in posture, the averted eyes, the way my father's shoulders sagged deeper with each piece of paper I placed down, told me that the story was no longer under their control. Lauren tried tears next, dabbing her eyes with a tissue as she declared that she had been through enough, that life had been hard on her, that she deserved support, and for a brief moment I almost felt the pull of old habits, the urge to comfort her, to downplay my own anger in order to preserve peace. But then I remembered the sleepless nights I had spent juggling rent and credit card bills while she received bailout after bailout, and I steeled myself against that reflex. Instead, I turned to the board and stated clearly that I was not asking them to punish her, only to uphold their own regulations, to ensure that liens were addressed and compliance issues resolved, the same way they would for any other homeowner. The strength in that position came not from cruelty, but from fairness, and I saw in the board members' nods that they recognized the legitimacy of what I was saying. My mother's response was as predictable as it was desperate. She accused me of being heartless, of enjoying the humiliation, of weaponizing paperwork to destroy the family. I met her eyes and replied, still calm, that I had given them opportunities to repay what was owed years ago, that I had asked politely, begged even, for fairness, and that what they called humiliation was simply exposure of facts they had chosen to bury. My father finally spoke, his voice low, saying perhaps it would be best to work something out quietly before things escalated further, but I shook my head and said it was already beyond quiet fixes, that the paperwork had been filed, the notices had been sent, and that the only way forward was resolution, not delay. At that point, I laid out the terms I had written the night before, not in a dramatic flourish, but in the same plain tone I had used all along, a repayment of the graduation money and college funds they had promised to restore, satisfaction of the contractor lien in full, a correction of the remodel compliance issue, and one written acknowledgement that these debts existed, nothing more, nothing less. I told them that if they met these conditions by the deadline, I would file a release and the matter would be closed, but if they stalled or tried to twist the narrative again, the lien would remain, interest would accumulate, and the HOA would continue enforcement. I could see the outrage flash across my mother's face, the disbelief in Lauren's eyes, the weary resignation in my father's slumped shoulders, but what mattered was that I had given them a clean off-ramp, a chance to address the truth without further spectacle. And whether they took it or not was entirely in their hands. When the meeting ended, neighbors avoided eye contact out of politeness, my parents stormed out with Lauren trailing behind, and I walked out alone, clutching my folder with the calm knowledge that for once I had not caved, I had not softened the blow. I had not sacrificed my own truth for the illusion of family harmony. Later that night, I received another text from my mother, this one more cutting than before, accusing me of being cruel, of betraying blood, of turning into someone she did not recognize, and I wrote back only one line: I am not being cruel. I am being specific. I pressed send and placed the phone face down, because the truth was no longer up for debate. The deadline was written, the terms were clear, and whether they saw it as cruelty or justice was irrelevant, because what mattered was that for the first time in my life, the balance of power had shifted, and it was no longer about feelings or family politics. It was about truth, documented, undeniable, and ready to be enforced. The deadline I had given them was not arbitrary. It was chosen with precision after reviewing the statutory timelines Alicia had explained to me, and when that date arrived without so much as a serious proposal from my parents or my sister, I knew they had decided to test whether I was bluffing, which in hindsight was their final mistake, because by then I had already accepted that once you begin a process like this you cannot back away without erasing the progress you have made and teaching the people who underestimated you that they were right to do so. On the morning of the deadline, I prepared the next set of legal documents, notices that would move the lien closer to enforcement, and I delivered them exactly as the law prescribed, without drama, without threats, without raised voices, simply as an action that followed logically from everything that had already happened, and in doing so I felt a strange mixture of calm and adrenaline, because while a part of me was still the daughter who had once begged for fairness, another part had evolved into someone who no longer asked but required, and that difference was no longer theoretical, it was written into the county records for anyone to see. The first true crack in their composure came not from Lauren, who had been oscillating between angry texts and silent treatment, but from my father, who called me late that evening and, in a voice that sounded heavier than I had ever heard it, admitted that I was right, admitted that over the years they had leaned on me again and again because I was reliable, because I would not collapse under the weight, because unlike Lauren I had no safety net, and therefore they could justify stealing pieces of mine. He said it as if confessing to a priest, as if putting the words into the air would absolve him, but the truth was that hearing him finally acknowledge it did not soothe me the way I once fantasized it would. Instead, it confirmed what I had already pieced together. That my invisibility had been convenient for them, that my sacrifices had been repackaged as independence, and that they had never expected me to hold them accountable. I told him, not unkindly but firmly, that acknowledgement was only half of what was required, and that words without restitution meant nothing, because I had given them too many chances to prove their sincerity, and each one had been wasted. The following day, perhaps sensing that the tide had turned, my parents arrived with Lauren at a mediation office I had suggested as a neutral ground, bringing with them what they called a family plan. That in reality was little more than another attempt to delay the inevitable, filled with vague promises of repayment over time and assurances that the remodel issues would be looked into soon. I listened politely, then slid the prepared settlement across the table, outlining in clear, unmistakable terms what was required: repayment of the documented sums they had taken from me in the past, Full satisfaction of the contractor lien now in my possession, correction of the remodel compliance issue flagged by the HOA, and the creation of a second lien in my name against Lauren's house for the remaining equity I had been denied, to be paid automatically upon sale or refinance. I told them this was not a negotiation, but an arrangement designed to close the chapter cleanly, and that their signature was the only variable left. My mother's outrage was immediate, accusing me once again of being vindictive, of trying to ruin my sister's life, of turning into someone cold and unrecognizable. But I did not respond to the attack because I had learned that defending myself only reinforced her narrative. Instead, I looked at the mediator, then at the notary who was present to finalize the agreement if they chose to sign, and I let the silence stretch until the weight of reality settled on them. My father eventually picked up the pen, read through the pages line by line, and after a long pause signed his name, while my mother's hand trembled as she followed, muttering about betrayal and cruelty. Though she too signed because she understood that refusing meant escalation they could no longer control. Lauren signed last, her signature sharp and angry, her eyes flashing with a mixture of humiliation and hatred, but the ink was still binding, and when the notary stamped the documents I felt the finality of it settle deep inside me like the closing of a door that had been stuck open for decades. There was, however, one final element they had not anticipated, and it was the page I had slipped into the settlement package at the last moment, a simple letter addressed to any future buyer of Lauren's house, disclosing the existence of my second lien and clarifying the terms under which it would be released. It was not dramatic, it was not vindictive, it was simply transparent, ensuring that no one could ever erase me from the story again, that my contribution, my sacrifice, and my claim would live on in the records as long as the property did. When my mother saw it, she looked at me with disbelief, whispering, "You cannot be serious," and I replied quietly that I was not only serious but finished, because I was no longer begging them to see me. I was ensuring that I could never be made invisible again. As we left the office, my mother asked in a brittle voice if I felt proud of myself, as though pride was the ultimate measure of whether my actions had been justified, and I told her no, I did not feel proud, I felt finished. And that distinction mattered because I was not chasing satisfaction or triumph, I was closing a chapter that had been open for far too long. I walked out with my copy of the stamped documents, knowing that whatever they told themselves, whatever story they spun to neighbors or extended family, the truth was now fixed in ink and seal, and there was nothing they could do to rewrite it. For the first time in my life, I was not the forgotten daughter or the backup plan. I was the one who had turned the tables, not through cruelty or spectacle, but through patience, precision, and an unshakable refusal to remain silent. And as I stepped into the cool air outside, I realized that the real victory was not in the money, not in the lien, not even in the forced acknowledgement of past wrongs, but in the simple fact that I had finally shifted the balance of power so completely that I no longer needed their recognition, because the records would speak for themselves, and the silence that once smothered me had been replaced by something far stronger. Proof, permanence, and the knowledge that I had finished the fight on my own terms.